We're watching something unprecedented unfold right before our eyes. The United States is sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, not in Texas or Alaska, but in Syria. And here's what nobody's telling you. This isn't about fighting terrorism anymore. It's about control. Pure, unfiltered control of resources that don't belong to us. President Trump recently made a statement that should shake every American to their core. He said, "We're keeping Syria's oil, just taking it. No international law, no United Nations approval, just raw power politics." This is the same playbook we've seen in Iraq, Libya, and now Ukraine. But here's the deeper truth that keeps me up at night. When the most powerful nation on earth operates outside the rules it helped create, when might makes right becomes our foreign policy doctrine, we're not just risking another war, we're dismantling the entire framework that's prevented World War III for 80 years. The question isn't whether this ends badly. The question is whether we'll recognize the danger before it's too late. This is about America's soul, and the stakes have never been higher. Let me tell you something that most Americans don't know. And frankly, something that our political establishment doesn't want you to know. When President Trump stands in front of cameras and casually mentions that we're keeping Syria's oil, he's not just making another provocative statement to dominate the news cycle. He's articulating a foreign policy doctrine that represents a fundamental break from 75 years of international order. And I need you to understand what this really means, not just for Syria, not just for the Middle East, but for every single one of us living in America today. I've spent decades studying international relations, advising governments, working with the United Nations, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that we are living through one of the most dangerous periods in modern history. But the danger doesn't come from where you think it does. It doesn't come from some distant enemy plotting against us. It comes from our own policies, our own actions, our own government's decisions that are made in our name with our tax dollars, justified by narratives that fall apart the moment you examine them closely. Let's start with Syria, because Syria is the perfect case study of how American foreign policy has gone completely off the rails. We were told that our involvement in Syria was about fighting ISIS, about combating terrorism, about protecting human rights. Those were the official narratives that justified our presence in a sovereign nation without that nation's permission, without United Nations authorization, without any legal basis whatsoever in international law. But now, President Trump has said the quiet part out loud. He's told us in plain English that we're there for the oil. We're occupying the eastern part of Syria, the part that happens to have the oil fields, and we're not leaving because that oil represents billions of dollars in resources. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. Really think about it. What does it mean when the United States of America, the country that helped write the United Nations Charter, the country that prosecuted Nazi leaders at Nuremberg for wars of aggression, the country that has positioned itself as the guardian of international law and human rights, openly declares that it's occupying another country's territory to take its natural resources? This isn't a complex legal question. This is actually very simple. Under international law, this is called pillaging. It's called theft. It's called illegal occupation. These aren't my interpretations. These are established principles of international law that have been recognized since the Geneva Conventions, principles that America itself insisted upon after World War II. But here's where it gets even more disturbing, and why I said this keeps me up at night. When America operates outside international law, when we simply take what we want because we have the military power to do so, we're not just violating abstract legal principles. We're destroying the entire system that has prevented great power conflicts from escalating into world wars for nearly 8 decades. You see, after World War II, after 50 million people died in the most devastating conflict in human history, the international community came together and said never again. They created the United Nations. They established international law. They set up mechanisms to resolve disputes peacefully. And most importantly, they agreed on one fundamental principle, that nations cannot simply invade other nations and take their resources. That might makes right is not an acceptable basis for international relations. And America was at the center of creating this system. American diplomats, American lawyers, American statesmen understood that even though we were the most powerful country in the world at the end of World War II, even though we had the atomic bomb and everyone else didn't, Even though we could have simply imposed our will on the entire planet, we chose instead to create a rules-based international order. Why? Because we understood that a world where the strong simply dominate the weak, where military might determines who gets what, is a world that inevitably leads to catastrophic wars. It's a world where every nation must constantly arm itself, constantly prepare for conflict, and constantly live in fear of stronger neighbors. It's a Hobbesian nightmare where life becomes, as the philosopher said, nasty, brutish, and short. But now we're abandoning that system. And Syria is just one example. Look at what we did in Libya. We went into Libya under the pretense of protecting civilians, authorized by the United Nations Security Council for a humanitarian intervention. But what did we actually do? We overthrew the government. We destroyed the state. We killed Muammar Gaddafi. And we left behind a failed state that has become a breeding ground for terrorists, a hub for human trafficking, and a humanitarian catastrophe. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton literally laughed when she heard about Gaddafi's death, saying, "We came, we saw, he died." Is that the behavior of a nation committed to international law and human dignity? Or is that the behavior of an empire that believes it can do whatever it wants, wherever it wants, with no accountability and no consequences? And then there's Iraq. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was based on lies. I'm not being hyperbolic here. I'm stating a documented fact. We were told Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. They didn't. We were told Iraq was connected to the September 11th attacks. It wasn't. We were told that overthrowing Saddam Hussein would bring democracy and stability to the Middle East. Instead, we unleashed sectarian violence that killed hundreds of thousands of people, created the conditions for ISIS to emerge, destabilized the entire region, and spent trillions of American taxpayer dollars in the process. And here's the thing that should outrage every American: nobody was held accountable. The officials who lied us into that war, who manipulated intelligence, who ignored warnings from experts, they didn't go to jail. They didn't even lose their jobs. Many of them are still influential voices in our foreign policy establishment, still appearing on television, still advising politicians, still pushing for more interventions, more wars, and more military solutions to every problem. Now, let's talk about what's happening right now in Ukraine, because Ukraine represents the same pattern playing out in an even more dangerous context. We're told that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked, that Vladimir Putin woke up one day and decided to invade his neighbor for no reason other than imperial ambition. But that narrative ignores decades of context that led to this catastrophic war. It ignores the expansion of NATO eastward, despite promises made to Soviet leaders that NATO would not move 1 inch east after German reunification. It ignores the role of the United States in supporting the 2014 coup in Ukraine that overthrew a democratically elected government. It ignores years of civil war in eastern Ukraine where the government in Kiev was shelling its own citizens. It ignores repeated diplomatic efforts by Russia to negotiate security arrangements that would address their legitimate concerns about having NATO military infrastructure on their border. Now, let me be absolutely clear about something, because I know how these discussions go. Saying that there is context to this war, saying that American and NATO policies contributed to creating the conditions for this conflict, is not the same as justifying Russia's invasion. The invasion was illegal. It violates international law. It has caused immense suffering. But if we want to end this war, if we want to prevent it from escalating into a nuclear confrontation, if we want to save Ukrainian lives and bring peace to that region, we need to understand how we got here. We need to be honest about the role that American foreign policy played in creating this disaster. And what are we doing now? We're pouring billions of dollars in weapons into Ukraine. We're training Ukrainian forces. We're providing intelligence and targeting information. We're effectively fighting a proxy war against Russia, a nuclear-armed power with thousands of warheads that could end civilization as we know it. And for what? What is our strategy here? What is our endgame? Are we trying to weaken Russia? Are we trying to achieve regime change in Moscow? Are we trying to break up the Russian Federation? Because if those are our goals, we need to be honest about what we're attempting to do. We're trying to strategically defeat a nuclear superpower. And anyone with even a basic understanding of history and nuclear deterrence should be terrified by that prospect. You see, there's this assumption in Washington that Russia will just accept strategic defeat, that Putin will just accept the humiliation of losing in Ukraine and the dismemberment of Russian power, and everything will be fine. But that assumption is extraordinarily dangerous. Nuclear powers don't accept strategic defeat. They escalate. They use whatever tools they have available, including their nuclear arsenals, rather than accept existential threats to their security. This isn't a controversial statement. This is basic nuclear deterrence theory that has been understood since the beginning of the Cold War. And yet, we're pursuing policies that seem designed to ignore this fundamental reality. And here's what makes me even more concerned. We're not just fighting a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. We're simultaneously engaging in strategic competition with China. We're building military alliances in Asia to contain China. We're conducting military exercises near Chinese territory. We're supporting Taiwan in ways that challenge the one China policy that has maintained peace in that region for decades. We're imposing sanctions and export controls on Chinese technology. We're essentially pursuing a new Cold War, except this time we're doing it against two nuclear-armed great powers simultaneously. This is unprecedented. Even during the height of the Cold War, American strategists understood that you don't fight on multiple fronts. You don't simultaneously antagonize all potential adversaries. You maintain some level of diplomatic engagement. You look for areas of cooperation. You manage competition carefully to prevent it from spiraling into conflict. But that's not what we're doing now. Instead, we have a bipartisan consensus in Washington that China is our enemy, that Russia is our enemy, that we need to confront them, contain them, defeat them. And this consensus crosses party lines. Democrats and Republicans might disagree about domestic policy, but when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to military spending, when it comes to confronting Russia and China, they're in complete agreement. And that should worry you, because when both parties agree on something, when there's no real debate, when dissenting voices are marginalized or ignored, that's when the most dangerous policies get implemented. Let me tell you what I think is really going on here, what the underlying drivers of this reckless foreign policy actually are. First, there's the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about in his farewell address. We spend more on our military than the next 10 countries combined. We have over 800 military bases in foreign countries. We have defense contractors who make billions of dollars from selling weapons. We have a revolving door between the Pentagon, defense contractors, and think tanks that advocate for aggressive foreign policies. These interests have enormous influence over our political system. They fund campaigns. They employ former government officials. They shape the public discourse through their think tanks and media presence. They have a vested interest in maintaining a state of perpetual conflict because conflict is profitable. Peace is bad for business when your business is selling weapons. Second, there's an ideological commitment to American hegemony, to the idea that America must remain the sole superpower, that we cannot tolerate any challenge to our dominance. Any country that doesn't follow our orders, any government that pursues independent policies, must be punished, sanctioned, overthrown, or destroyed. This ideology pervades our foreign policy establishment. It's taught in our elite universities. It's promoted by our major think tanks. It's assumed by our media. It's fundamentally incompatible with a multipolar world where other countries have their own interests, their own security concerns, and their own right to develop and prosper without American permission. Third, there's a disturbing lack of consequences for failed policies. The same people who got Iraq wrong are still making policy. The same think tanks that advocated for intervention in Libya are still influential. The same media outlets that cheered for war after war are still shaping public opinion. There's no accountability. There's no learning from mistakes. There's just a perpetual cycle of intervention failure and then moving on to the next intervention without ever questioning the fundamental assumptions that keep leading us into disaster after disaster. Now, let's come back to Trump's statement about Syria's oil, because I want you to understand how this connects to everything I've been talking about. When Trump says we're keeping the oil, he's being more honest than most politicians. He's stating explicitly what has often been implicit in American foreign policy. But his honesty doesn't make the policy better, it makes it worse. Because now we're not even pretending to care about international law. We're not even pretending to care about human rights or democracy or any of the noble principles we claim to stand for. We're just taking what we want because we can. And what does that tell the rest of the world? What message does that send to every other country on the planet? It tells them that international law doesn't matter. It tells them that the United Nations is irrelevant. It tells them that treaties, agreements, and diplomatic negotiations are meaningless if America decides they don't serve our interests. It tells them that the only thing that matters is military power, that if you want to be secure, if you want to protect your resources, if you want to preserve your sovereignty, you need to build up your military, you need to get nuclear weapons, you need to be strong enough that America thinks twice before coming after you. And that creates exactly the kind of world that the post-World War II international order was designed to prevent. It creates a world where every nation is arming itself, where conflicts escalate quickly because there are no accepted rules or mechanisms for peaceful resolution, where the risk of catastrophic war increases exponentially. And here's the ultimate irony that I find almost unbearable. We claim that we're making America safer. We claim that our military interventions, our military bases around the world, our enormous defense spending, our aggressive foreign policies are all about protecting American security. But think about what we've actually achieved. We're less safe than we were 20 years ago. We've spent trillions of dollars on wars that accomplish nothing except creating more instability, more terrorism, more anti-American sentiment around the world. We've made enemies where we didn't need to have enemies. We've destroyed countries that never threatened us. We've killed hundreds of thousands of people, created millions of refugees, and destabilized entire regions. And somehow we're supposed to believe that this has made us safer. The reality is that our foreign policy is making us less safe, not more safe. Every drone strike that kills civilians creates more terrorists than it eliminates. Every country we sanction turns to China and Russia for partnership. Every government we try to overthrow reminds other governments why they need nuclear weapons to deter American intervention. Every military base we build creates resentment in the local population. Every war we fight drains our resources and distracts us from the real challenges facing our country. Challenges like crumbling infrastructure, inadequate health care, failing schools, growing inequality, and climate change. These are the actual threats to American security and prosperity. But we're spending trillions of dollars on military adventures overseas instead of investing in our own society. And let's talk about the moral dimension of this, because ultimately this isn't just about strategy or security or international law. It's about what kind of country we want to be. It's about our values, our principles, our humanity. When Trump talks about just killing in the context of dealing with our adversaries or people we view as threats, what does that say about us as a nation? Is that who we are? Is that who we want to be? A country that casually discusses killing people, that treats human life as expendable, that sees violence as the first option rather than the last resort. I think about the young American soldiers we send to these wars. I think about the 1 8-year-olds, 1 9-year-olds, 2 0-year-olds who join the military often because they don't have better economic opportunities, often because they want to serve their country, often because they believe in the ideals America is supposed to represent, and we send them to fight in wars based on lies, wars without clear objectives, wars that serve corporate interests rather than national interests, wars that traumatize them physically and psychologically, and when they come home, we don't take care of them properly. We have veterans sleeping on the streets, veterans struggling with PTSD and addiction, veterans unable to access adequate health care. That's shameful. That's a betrayal of the people we asked to put their lives on the line for this country. And I think about the people in the countries where we intervene, the families destroyed by our bombs, the children growing up without parents because of our drone strikes, the civilians who live in constant fear because we've turned their countries into war zones. These are human beings just like us. They have hopes and dreams and loved ones just like we do. They want to live in peace and raise their families and have opportunities for their children just like we do. But we've decided that their lives matter less than our geopolitical objectives, that their suffering is acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of our interests. How is that morally defensible? How is that consistent with the values we claim to hold as Americans? I'm not naive. I understand that the world is complicated. I understand that there are real threats out there. I understand that sometimes military force is necessary. But what I'm talking about is a pattern of behavior, a systematic approach to foreign policy that prioritizes military intervention over diplomacy, that sees every problem as a nail because all we have is a hammer, that assumes American dominance is more important than international cooperation. This isn't about one war or one intervention. This is about a fundamental approach to how we engage with the world that is counterproductive, that is morally wrong, and that is ultimately threatening our own security and the security of the entire planet. We need a different approach. We need a foreign policy based on diplomacy, on international cooperation, on addressing the root causes of conflict rather than just trying to manage the symptoms through military force. We need to invest in development, in education, in healthcare, in addressing poverty and inequality, because those are the conditions that create instability and conflict. We need to respect international law, not just when it's convenient for us, but always because a rules-based international order benefits everyone, including the United States. We need to see other countries as potential partners rather than as enemies, competitors, or threats. We need to understand that in an interconnected world, our security is tied to their security. Our prosperity is tied to their prosperity. Our future is tied to their future. This isn't idealism. This is realism. The real realists are the ones who understand that you cannot maintain global dominance through military force indefinitely. The real realists are the ones who understand that climate change doesn't care about national borders and requires international cooperation to address. The real realists are the ones who understand that pandemics, like we just experienced, require global coordination and solidarity. The real realists are the ones who understand that in a world with nuclear weapons, with artificial intelligence, with biological threats, and with challenges that transcend national boundaries, we need to work together rather than constantly fighting each other for dominance and control. So when President Trump talks about keeping Syria's oil, when he talks about just killing, when he embodies this aggressive might makes right approach to foreign policy, he's not being strong. He's being reckless. He's not protecting America. He's endangering America. He's not advancing American interests. He's undermining the international system that has allowed America to prosper and remain secure for decades. And the tragedy is that this isn't just about Trump. This is bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans have both contributed to the policies that have brought us to this dangerous moment. Obama dramatically expanded the drone program. Biden has continued supporting the war in Ukraine with no clear strategy for peace. This is a systemic problem that requires a fundamental rethinking of how America engages with the world. And that rethinking isn't going to come from our political establishment. It has to come from ordinary Americans demanding something different, demanding accountability, and demanding policies that actually serve our interests and our values rather than the interests of defense contractors and the ideological commitments of a foreign policy elite that has failed us time and time again.